you're an entrepreneur from Malawi or Zambia and have just been offered a chance to attend a global trade event in the United States, hold on before rushing to get your visa. There's a new US policy you absolutely need to know about. If you don't have $15,000 ready to hand over, then sorry to say, you won't be allowed to step foot into the US. Yes, President Trump has done it again. He's introduced another visa rule, and once more, African countries find themselves among the primary targets. But what's the purpose of this $15,000 bond? Why is it required? And how should African nations respond to such a move? Let's dive into the details and unpack what this means for African entrepreneurs and travelers. This marks Trump's second-term comeback, bringing with it a full return to strict anti-immigration policies. As part of this crackdown, the U.S. State Department announced a new rule requiring travelers from certain countries to post bonds of up to $15,000 before entering the United States. According to the State Department's final rule, published on August 5th, this 12-month pilot program affects holders of B1 business and B2 tourism visas, and it takes effect on August 20th. The policy specifically targets travelers from countries with historically higher rates of visa overstays. Put simply, if you're visiting the US from one of these countries, you'll need to pay a refundable $15,000 cash deposit before you even set foot in the country. The purpose? To ensure you don't overstay your visa. For example, if your visa allows a stay of 3 months, you'll pay the $15,000 up front. You won't have access to this money during your visit. But if you leave the US promptly after your visa expires, the full $15,000 will be refunded to you. In essence, it's a simple but strict guarantee designed to prevent tourists from overstaying their welcome in the United States. But for many Africans and others from targeted countries, this poses a significant financial barrier to travel and participation in global events. But here's where things get really interesting. This $15,000 bond requirement does not apply to every traveler heading to the United States. According to the US government, the new rule specifically targets citizens from countries with high visa overstay rates. It excludes visitors from Mexico, Canada, and more than 40 countries enrolled in the US Visa Waiver Program, a program that lets citizens from these nations travel to the US for tourism or business for up to 90 days without a visa. In plain terms, this policy is selective, and it disproportionately affects certain countries, particularly African nations. In fact, just last week, the U.S. State Department confirmed that visitors from Zambia and Malawi would be the first to be targeted under this new policy. Beginning August 20th, nationals of Malawi and Zambia applying for B1, B2 business and tourist visas will be required to post a bond of up to $15,000, said Tammy Bruce, a spokesperson for the State Department. The department also noted that additional countries will be added to the bond program based on factors like high visa overstay rates, deficiencies in screening and vetting information, countries offering citizenship by investment programs. Importantly, the list of targeted countries may be revised throughout the program, meaning more African nations or others could face this steep financial barrier in the future. This targeted approach raises serious questions about fairness and discrimination, especially considering that many countries with lower overstay rates and those closer to the US are exempt from this burden. Some might argue that the US is justified in imposing this policy. It is, after all, a sovereign nation with the right to protect its borders, and the decision is framed as a response to the problem of visa overstays. That sounds reasonable on the surface. But when you dive into the numbers, especially for African countries, the story looks quite different. According to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, in 2023, about 14% of Malawian visitors overstayed their visas, and for Zambia, it was around 11%. At first glance, these rates seem relatively high, which the U.S. uses to justify the new bond requirement. But here's the catch. Both Malawi and Zambia are small countries with very low overall numbers of visitors to the U.S. In 2023, only 1,655 Malawians traveled to the U.S. for business or pleasure, and of those, only 237 overstayed their visas. Similarly, Zambia sent 3,493 visitors to the U.S., with just 388 overstays recorded. So what does this tell us? While the percentage of overstays looks concerning, the actual number of people involved is quite small. These are not mass flows of visitors abusing the system. The US, however, is applying a blanket financial penalty that affects all applicants from these countries, regardless of their individual histories or intentions. This policy, then, doesn't seem proportionate to the scale of the issue. In other words, a handful of overstayers is leading to a massive financial barrier for thousands of law-abiding travelers who simply want to do business or visit the US. It raises the question, is this really about immigration control, or is it about discouraging African visitors altogether? The data certainly suggests the latter, and that's why this policy has sparked outrage and calls for serious reconsideration. Here's the situation laid bare. The actual number of visa overstays from Malawi and Zambia is tiny when compared to larger countries. Travelers from Europe, Mexico, Asia, and North America have far higher numbers of overstays, yet none of them are subjected to a $15,000 visa bond. In fact, as of 2023, the highest number of overstays in the US came from Mexico, yet Mexican visitors are exempt from Trump's bond policy. So why are Malawi and Zambia, whose combined overstays don't even reach 1,000, being specifically targeted? The answer is painfully obvious. This policy is not about curbing illegal migration. It is a manifestation of a big nation oppressing smaller, less powerful ones. This is about fueling a negative narrative about Africa, a so-called third world continent, painting its citizens as poor, underdeveloped, and inherently risky to the US. The messaging implies that African visitors bring chaos, theft, and unrest, but the truth is that most of these problems originate within the US itself, not from African immigrants. In short, this policy is less about security or migration control and more about discrimination, control, and the perpetuation of false stereotypes. It highlights the deep inequities in how African nations are treated compared to wealthier countries, even when their actual numbers don't justify such measures. You see, the common perception in the West is that all African migrants are desperate to flee poverty, insecurity, and instability, rushing to Europe because their continent is somehow unlivable. But the data tells a very different story. According to the United Nations, in 2020, the total number of African migrants was 40.6 million. That's only 14.6% of the world's total migrants. Compare that to Asia, which accounts for 41%, and even Europe at 22.5%. So what does this mean? Simply put, Europe and Asia produce far more migrants than Africa ever does. Yet the narrative that Africa is the source of a migration crisis persists. Even within Africa, 8% of migrants stay on the continent. Only about 20% attempt to move to Europe, and out of that group, just 8% are refugees or enter illegally. The remaining 12% travel legally, often by plane, investing huge amounts of money to pursue opportunities abroad. Despite this, the bias against Africans remains deeply entrenched. The West, driven by a belief that African migrants will overrun Europe, continues to tighten visa restrictions, specifically targeting African citizens. At the forefront of this crackdown, President Trump, enforcing policies that are less about security and more about control, prejudice, and the reinforcement of outdated stereotypes. Since returning to office, Trump has doubled down on his hardline immigration policies from his first term. But this time, it's even more aggressive, especially targeting countries that are poor, black, or politically independent from US interests. According to reports, the Trump administration is preparing an expansive new travel ban, potentially affecting citizens from up to 43 countries, including a significant number of African nations. A draft proposal, revealed by the New York Times on March 14, 2025, shows that this plan is broader and more severe than the restrictions seen during his first term, raising alarm about its impact on global mobility and international relations. The draft reportedly divides countries into 3 tiers: red, orange, and yellow, with varying levels of restriction. Tier Red is the most extreme, imposing a total ban on entry for citizens from 11 countries, including 3 African nations: Libya, Somalia, and Sudan. This new approach signals a clear shift in US immigration policy, one that disproportionately affects African countries and reinforces the perception that the West still treats the continent as a subordinate actor on the global stage. Tier Orange adds another 10 countries to the restrictions. In this category, visas would be sharply limited, primarily allowing entry only to affluent business travelers. Ordinary citizens from these countries are essentially barred from visiting the US. African nations in this tier include Eritrea, Sierra Leone, and South Sudan. The largest category, Tier Yellow, grants just 60 days for 22 countries to address alleged deficiencies in security vetting or risk escalation to stricter tiers. Countries in this tier include Angola, Benin, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Cape Verde, Chad, Republic of Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Gambia, Liberia, Malawi, Mali, Mauritania, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, Sao Tome and Principe, Vanuatu, and Zimbabwe. The circulation of this information on social media sparked widespread reactions across Africa. Many users urged African nations to focus on self-development rather than relying on Western approval. One user wrote, "Funny thing is, citizens from the majority of the highlighted countries would most likely be refused a visa 7 out of 10 times. Banning would just send the message, don't bother trying." Another user said, "Banning nearly half of African nations from entering the US is not about security, it's about discrimination. Africa is a vital part of the global community, and such policies only deepen division instead of fostering cooperation. And we fully agree. This visa ban has nothing to do with US security. It is discrimination disguised as policy, a blunt reminder that even today, the West still views Africa as a subordinate continent." This is evident in the fact that hundreds of international students have had their visas revoked, and several others were detained on college campuses across the US, often without warning or any chance to appeal. According to the US State Department, these measures target individuals who have engaged in activities that run counter to US national interests. In many cases, those affected had participated in pro-Palestinian activities. Think about that. Students exercising their voices on global issues suddenly find themselves barred from education simply because their views don't align with the US agenda. But that's not all. Just last month, the Trump administration approved a new $250 visa integrity fee for all non-immigrant travelers. In other words, if your family or friends want to visit you in the US, they must pay an additional $250 on top of existing visa fees. The State Department says this fee is refundable if travelers comply with the terms of their visas. But how it will actually be refunded and what proof travelers must provide to show compliance remains unclear. When you look at all of this together, the message from the US is unmistakable. If you are not from a wealthy Western nation that follows US interests, then you are simply not welcome. Some might argue that these restrictions push Africans to focus on developing their own continent, which is true. But here's the catch. The world is now so interconnected that migration is almost impossible to avoid. Limiting access for Africans doesn't stop them from seeking opportunities. It only forces them to find alternatives, often with nations that approach the continent as partners rather than subjects. You see, the data tells a story that the West often ignores. Not all Africans travel to the US or Europe in search of a better life. Many travel for pleasure, some for education, and many for business. Imagine this. You work for an international company and your firm decides to host a conference in the US. With these new restrictions targeting African countries, how would you even attend? How could you benefit from opportunities designed to expand your career or business? The answer is clear. These policies create a huge barrier. They are not just inconvenient, they are an injustice. Yes, the US is a sovereign nation. It can make decisions it believes protect its interests. But sovereignty comes with responsibility. When your decisions systematically discriminate against entire countries or continents, it crosses the line from protection into oppression. Perhaps the time has come for Africa to speak with one voice, to challenge these injustices and demand respect on the global stage. Sadly, most African governments have remained silent. The African Union, the supposed voice of the continent, has said nothing. This silence sends a message. Africans can be disregarded without consequence. Meanwhile, countries with closer ties to the US, like Egypt, Angola, Zambia, and the DRC, are quietly negotiating behind the scenes, trying to avoid being added to the blacklist. This reactive approach only highlights the urgent need for a united, proactive African stance on global policies that affect its citizens. But negotiations between the South African president and Trump a few weeks ago should tell these African leaders what Trump truly thinks about them. The fact is that Trump and his team clearly believes it can denigrate African states while still pursuing its strategic goals, whether on minerals, migration, or trade. They're betting African states will simply go along. Trump is banking on the old adage, the strong do what they will and the weak do what they must. Sadly, Trump is right. African governments and the AU are so dependent on the US and other foreign entities that Africa has been emptied of any iota of courage, dignity, or idea to stand for itself. We saw it play out after the South Africa president boasted that South Africa will not bow to the US following Trump's sanctions regarding its land policy. A few days later, we saw the South African president travel to the US to explain himself like a little child to President Trump. Not surprisingly, he got nothing for his efforts but ridicule and humiliation. Again, we saw this play out when the Liberia president said yes sir to President Trump. In their own countries, African leaders often project power and authority, but the truth is harsher. The majority lack the backbone to stand up for their people on the global stage. They speak boldly, but when it matters most, their words often fade into silence. It's a sad reality, but it is Africa's reality. Perhaps the next generation of African leaders, those who understand sovereignty, dignity, and global respect, will finally change this narrative. What do you think? Are Africa's leaders truly strong, or is it time for a new generation to rise? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more insights.